Elle Moxley can still remember the first time she ever saw a drag queen. She was just 12 years old at her hometown's local pride parade in Columbus, Ohio. But in that moment, she remembers something felt off.
The drag performers that I saw were all white. So as a child, I had become very familiar with RuPaul through pop culture. RuPaul's cameo in the movie Crooklyn and all of the television shows that existed. So I always knew that, drag queens existed. I just didn't really know in what capacity or where the Black ones were, which was most of my life. Where are all the Black people is like a constant question I've asked growing up in middle America.
Today, Moxley is an artist, director, human rights advocate, and a visionary. She is the founder and executive director of the Marsha P. Institute, an organization committed to advocating for human rights for Black people in the trans community. But it took her until she moved to New York before she saw a Black drag queen in person. What was so surprising about that is Black history and drag are inexplicably intertwined. I'm Cheyenne Daniels, race and politics reporter for The Hill, and this is The Switch Up. Today, we're talking about the history of drag, how Black Americans started it, the influence Black drag performers have had on our culture, and how Black drag performers continue pushing forward amid growing attacks on the LGBTQ community. On April 13, 1888, the Washington Post ran an article titled "Negro Dive Raided: 13 Black men dressed as women surprised at supper and arrested." One of those men was William Dorsey Swann, or to his friends, the Queen. Born into slavery in Maryland in 1860, Swan was the first known self-proclaimed drag queen.
So many people would love for the idea of drag queen to be a new phenomenon, or for those who are LGBT to be a new phenomenon. And the reality is that we've always been here throughout history. We just were Black. And so we weren't supposed to be here. And if we were Black, we definitely weren't supposed to be anything else.
For all intents and purposes, Swan was a revolutionary. Before President Abraham Lincoln freed the enslaved with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Swan was the property of a white woman named Anne Murray. After the emancipation, Swan moved to Washington, D.C., where he began hosting drag balls. When the officers raided Swan's event in 1888, he tried to stop them, even allegedly telling the police lieutenant in charge, "You is no gentleman." As a brawl broke out, the Queen's gorgeous dress of cream-colored satin was torn to shreds. It wasn't the first time police raided one of Swan's parties, and it most certainly wasn't the last. On the night of January 14th, 1887, the Washington Critic reported that 6 colored men, dressed in elegant female attire, were arraigned in the dock at the police court this morning on a charge of being suspicious persons. They nearly all had on low neck and short sleeve silk dresses, several of them with trains, as well as corsets, bustles, long hose and slippers, and everything that goes to make a female's dress complete. In 1896, after being sentenced to 10 months in jail on the charge of keeping a disorderly house, or, in other words, for running a brothel, Swan demanded President Grover Cleveland pardon him for holding a drag ball. It was a historic demand. Swan became the first recorded American to legally demand the LGBTQ community's right to assemble without the threat of criminalization. Much of what we know about the Queen was uncovered by the work of historian and researcher Channing Joseph. But today, many in the LGBTQ and drag communities point to Swan as the man who birthed drag performance as we know it. And, advocates say, drag has become embedded in our culture. And not just because of RuPaul's Drag Race.
Bugs Bunny was actually the first drag queen that I ever encountered.
That's Vernis McFarland, founder of the Mahogany Project, a Texas based organization designed to provide safe spaces for transgender and queer folk.
So we've all have seen versions of Looney Tunes where Bugs Bunny dressed up as the version of Chiquita Banana, where he puts on the bra, he puts on the fruit hat, and he danced the full Elmer Fudd, right? So as a child, that's my earliest introduction of drag was it being layered in my cartoons.
Many may be unaware of what drag entails, but in essence, it encompasses a type of performance art that uses costumes, makeup, and other tools to present exaggerated forms of gender expression. The Human Rights Center explains that drag performance is a way to critique gender inequalities and to imagine a transformational future where people are truly free in how they choose to express themselves. And that's exactly what drag performance does for Blaq Dynamite, a Black drag king in Washington, D.C.
Well, I'd always been a performer. As a young kid, I'd started in the church, and then throughout grade school, I'd done plays and musical theater and stuff like that. But those were always like painfully gendered. And as a child, I wasn't a traditionally like feminine child. There was no like real place for me. So once I went to college, I started performing in a group that did a Rocky Horror Picture Show, and all of the gender bending that entails. So this is like a chance for me to explore parts of my gender that I hadn't really been able to fully express. And it was actually through that group, a friend in that group needed someone to be a boyfriend for a performance for hers, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. And so I put on a little mustache and found a suit and did my best impersonation of dude.
Drag kings aren't heard of as much as drag queens, but Blaq Dynamite points out that kings have been around just as long as queens.
Well, first, drag kings have been around as long as queens, and I think our invisibility is a testament to our performance. You don't even know that we're there. Often, when performing in like cis male spaces, cis male gay spaces, I confuse them. They can't tell what gender I was assigned at birth, and that just tells me that I'm doing my job. But at the same time, it's kind of a double-edged sword. I'm passing so well that they don't even realize what they're looking at, and there's sort of an invisibility there. So for a lot of performers, they make it a point to make sure that that no, I am not cis male. Yes, performers other than people who are doing feminine drag exist. And I like that. I like where the art form is going. I feel like all art should evolve with the time. Back in the day, drag was not only art, it was also survival work for a lot of performers. And it was a way to practice being able to pass as cis members of society. But now that we're in an era where variation of gender is more accepted, that variation is now bleeding into art. The whole art imitates life thing. So I'm pleased to see that we are getting a little more exposure. I wish that we were getting a little more, but yeah, we're just gonna continue just being who we are and who we've always been.
Drag performers are often conflated with someone who is gay or someone who is transgender, but McFarland says a drag performer does not need to identify as either, or vice versa.
Drag is one of the oldest forms of entertainment that has ever existed when only men could participate in theater. And so, guess what? When there were female roles, guess who had to occupy them? And so, and the second thing in that is RuPaul says, when you're born and everything else is drag. And I think that is so true for so many reasons, right? The clothing that we put on, the versions of ourselves that we would create with our friends, with our families, with our co-workers, they're not oftentimes the same. They are oftentimes intertwined. We oftentimes show up as different people. We oftentimes cut and color our hair. We style ourselves different. And all of those things are a form of drag, whether you want to accept it are not, right? The moments that we are our truest selves are when we are in the shower and water is running down us and it is washing off whatever makeup or eyeliner, if you have it on or don't, or when you are completely yourself at your most vulnerable, right? That's when we're us. That's when we're our most authentic. Everything else, once we step out that door, or from the moment you open your eyes and your feet hit that ground, everything else that we're offering up is a persona, is an illusion. And that is the same thing that drag is.
But more important than just how people present themselves physically are the words they use. And there's no doubt that much of the colloquialisms we use today were created by Black drag performers. Phrases like, "Yes, Queen," were being used literally decades before a fan shouted it at Lady Gaga. The phrase originated in the 1980s in ballroom culture in New York. And speaking of the rhetoric of the time, sayings like voguing were literally snatched from ballroom performers and popularized by Madonna's hit song Vogue.
When you look at Atlanta Housewives, right, a lot of their language, a lot of their culture, a lot of their imagery is built off of that, of trans people and drag entertainers and queer culture. It has a stronghold on how those women show up in the world, from the people who do their hair, from the people who style them, and again, from the language that they use. So the language that has shown up in the club that drag queens and queer people and trans people have always introduced in our settings that we have had access to has now made it mainstream. Where do you think the words "getting the tea" came from? I hate to say it, heterosexual people are just not that creative, where they come up with this fabulous language to describe things. It just does not happen in this way.
For Blaq Dynamite, the fact that Black drag and Black queer culture has had so much impact on society isn't all that surprising.
I think it's a larger connection. I think drag is just a piece of how Black culture has always been like the main crux of art, of artistry. There isn't an artist out here in whatever medium that has not been influenced by the Black culture or other Black artists. So this is just another, like, we're just another division of Black art being influential in this country. The traditional drag kings from back in the day, they were very much part of the vaudeville kind of show. They would be part of a variety show. You'd be next to like burlesque dancers and, contortionists, and then you'd have, male and female impersonators. We're part of that. But also, when you add Black culture into that element, you add things that other cultures just don't have. Whereas, we're having in the jazz culture, so you had some, drag kings imitating jazz artists. You had all of this artistry that already existed in the Black community now lending itself to drag, and vice versa. Some of that drag, some of those, artists who were also trans, also lending, their aesthetic and their artistry ended up bleeding into drag culture as a whole. It's indicative of how, Black culture is kind of absorbed by this country and continuously used.
But with so much of Black history embedded in drag performance, hard conversations sometimes crop up. Blaq Dynamite said there have been times when they've discussed whether non-Black performers are engaging in blackface when they entertain.
It's very strange, especially in drag, since everything's supposed to be kind of an exaggerated of a identity, a masculine or a feminine identity. We have had these conversations with drag queens that do Black music that are not Black, on whether or not does that count as blackface? Does that count as appropriation? And I think one can make an argument that it does, but in the context that the person is not transforming the artwork and making it into performance, they are just performing Blackness. In some contexts, we do have to be careful about what we want to put out there as far as cultural, whether or not exposing that to audiences that don't understand will result in that culture being exploited.
But both Black and queer identities are facing growing attacks. Limitations placed on Black history are rising. Bans on books delving into racism and gender identity are surging. And drag performers are being attacked, physically and legislatively. Perhaps most infamously, Florida GOP Governor Ron DeSantis attempted to ban an advanced placement program centered on African American studies, in part because of a section discussing Black queer history. When it comes to attacks on drag performance in particular, Brooke Migden, who covers LGBTQ issues for The Hill, said these attacks actually aren't new.
It's definitely not new. I think there's always at least been some kind of pushback to drag performance, something that pushes the boundaries of gender and social norms. But we've really seen that pushback ramp up sometime in the last 3 or 4 years or so. It really does follow this trend that we've been seeing regarding anti-LGBTQ legislation and sentiment more broadly. So, I would say we first really started to notice pushback against drag in this coordinated way that we're seeing now, probably sometime in the last 3 years.
Some of that pushback has targeted an event known as Drag Queen Story Hour, which usually takes place in a public library, public park, sometimes at a school. Drag performers dress up in their persona and simply read children's books to a group of kids. For many, Drag Queen Story Hours help dismantle stereotypes and create a safe space for children, particularly kids within the LGBTQ community, to see themselves reflected and celebrated in our larger society. But sadly, some of the pushback has turned violent.
We've seen organized hate groups like the Proud Boys, Patriot Front, have attended Pride events and drag queen story hours. They argue that drag performance is something that's fundamentally sexual and inappropriate in nature, especially for children. And that's kind of been this rallying cry among those groups and the right more broadly to push back against these performances. So last year, there was a big anti-drag push in mostly GOP-led state legislatures. We've seen, I believe, 6 states ban drag performances. A handful of them only ban drag performances explicitly, they only explicitly mention drag, like Montana, for example, and Tennessee, which passed the first drag ban, or restrictions on drag, rather, in the nation last year. Other states, like Texas, have passed legislation restricting what they call adult performances, or performances that they say are sexual in nature. So while they don't explicitly mention drag, we do know that they're meant to restrict those performances because the state legislators who have put those laws forward have mentioned drag on the State House floor.
Tennessee Senate Majority Leader Jack Johnson, a Republican, introduced legislation last year that would prohibit drag entertainers from performing on public property or at private functions where their performance may be viewed by a minor. At the time, Johnson said there's an issue with men dressed as women simulating sex acts in public parks in front of kids.
I think at the end of the day, this is something that I feel is a projection from those who put that idea forth. I was raised that there's a time and a place for everything. And so, just as a parent, you're not having sex in front of your children, neither are drag queens. The behaviors that people allege are associated with drag queens and their children, or any of those type of concerns, I think are really trifling. Honestly, I don't even know. It's not a smart concept. So it's very hard to have a intellectual response to something that's so absurd. So I typically don't pay those type of things any mind, because I really feel like those are things that are alleged to distract people and to try to manipulate people into thinking something sinister about a group of people. And we've seen that historically done. We've seen that done to every racial minority or marginalized race group in the world. So I think those who are empowered by sexuality, who are empowered by gender, are always targeted. Because in this world, if you are not a cis white gay man, you are not looked at as being worthy. And I think that's really what's at the heart of any of those attempts at alleging that story times with children by drag queens is perverted. It's just really sad and disgusting and despicable what people will do to try to harm and destroy others.
But Johnson isn't the only elected official to take a stance against drag performance. In the summer of 2022, DeSantis filed a complaint against a Miami restaurant that had hosted a drag brunch event with children present. He cited a 1947 state Supreme Court ruling that men impersonating women in a suggestive and indecent fashion constitutes a public nuisance. He even suggested that parents who take their children to such functions could be investigated by Florida's Child Protective Services Department. But those at the federal level have also taken a stand against drag performance. In a campaign ad ahead of Florida Senator Marco Rubio's midterm election, a video pans over a drag queen story hour event in Los Angeles as the senator warns of the radical left.
The radical left will destroy America if we don't stop them. They indoctrinate children and try to turn boys into girls.
We've seen some pushback at the federal level, nothing like really material, because those efforts have been thwarted by Democrats in Congress. Last year, we saw a big push by Republicans in the House and also the Senate, to a lesser extent, in federal funding bills last year. They targeted funding for drag performances. For example, in last year's NDAA, they explicitly included a provision that would prevent funding available through the bill from being used to fund drag performances in any way. We've also seen the military, Pentagon officials step in to ban drag performances from military bases, a move that was celebrated by Republicans in Congress as well.
Pro-LGBTQ advocates are working to counter the narratives of drag and LGBTQ identifying people in general somehow being inherently inappropriate.
These advocates are responding in a similar way to how LGBTQ advocates are responding more broadly to anti-LGBTQ legislation, and that's just by continuing to do what they do, existing loudly and proudly, and not disappearing or shrinking in the face of these attacks. That mostly takes the form of grassroots movements. Late last month in May, we saw a coalition of drag performers get together and form something that they're calling the Committee, which is a nationwide network of drag performers meant to be a resource for others who are facing attacks either on their personal safety, on their art form, and other things like that.
But these laws have a direct impact on performers like Blaq Dynamite.
I'd like to ask them when we became responsible for raising everyone else's children. And I'd also like to ask why drag performers are held to such a standard and no one else is. You know, there's sexualization in movies, in plays and theater. There's sexualization in music, and music is one of the most accessible forms of artwork. But, you know, they're not held to the same standard. They're not being protested as heavily. They're even being, promoted or rewarded. I'm sure Taylor Swift has, millions of fans that are under the age of 18. And the things that she talks about are very mature. But, it's only when it comes to drag performance, which is a performance of gender, that now all of a sudden we are some kind of threat to children specifically. None of traditional drag performance is geared towards children or in places where children would be. So I'm just, I'm mostly confused when when things like this happen. I understand that this is just the scapegoat for politicians. This is a way to direct the attention on a marginalized group and to use them as, the current, threat, which then emboldens their voter base and causes, people to vote for these people. Being raised Black, you kind of get used to it, and then coming out as queer or trans, then it just adds another layer to it. But it's it's different from our non-Black counterparts. Is with if it wasn't for the queer and transness, then all this will go away. It doesn't go away. I constantly remind people, I'm like, look, my existence is political. It always has been. So everything I do then ends up being political. And to have politicians try and diminish essentially your culture, try to tell you that it doesn't exist, and try to tell other people, hey, don't pay attention to this, it doesn't exist. It's belittling, it's demeaning, but it also kind of it emboldens me to continue. Sometimes it's going to be ugly continuing to do what you do, but eventually, down the line, the generations that come after me, they're going to benefit from me holding the door open, essentially.
Though many hope things will change, McFarland says those who hold the power are also holding on to fear. And until that fear is eradicated, the persecution will continue.
The fear will always be of things that are different, things that are other, things that are unknown. Um, it made me a little emotional. One of my favorite quotes from The Color Purpose: "They don't like people being too wild or too free." And I think whenever we find an opportunity to be too wild, too free, too Black, too proud, too queer, too trans, people will always find an opportunity to find fear in that, because the idea is that it's wild and we can't control it. It's a bottle of light just waiting to just break free, and we cannot control this. And I think whenever we find the opportunity to be too wild, too free, too bold, too Black, too boisterous, it will always be feared. And I think when we learn to accept that it's okay for people to be themselves, it's okay for us to be as diverse and as beautiful. I want to use a box of crayons that have so many colors we can't even give them names. And I don't think we are ready for that yet, because people still fear us. And so once I think you have to ask the people that held on to the fear, because the rest of us, we're ready. We're out here living loud, proud, in color, fully realized. Yeah. Seeing younger people being happier earlier, finding themselves earlier, it makes me happy. So I think we have to ask the people who hold the fear, what are you afraid of?
But as the attacks continue, McFarland does offer words of encouragement to those who are facing discrimination.
You take what you are experiencing, you take that hate, you take everything that they throw at you, and you make it beautiful. You make it as beautiful as you possibly can. You harness that hate and you turn it into love. You turn it into the energy that you need to go out and flourish and be the most amazing you that you can be. They will not win. I promise you. History has shown us over and over and over again that we will progress, we will move forward, and the people who fear change will just simply be left behind. So you take everything that they throw at you and you harness it for the good and the better of you.
I'm your host, Cheyenne Daniels, race and politics reporter for The Hill. And from all of us at The Hill, thanks for listening to this episode of The Switch Up. We'll have more episodes delving into the intersection of race and politics soon, so be sure to follow The Hill at THEHILL on all social media for future updates, including episode drops and articles. And you can listen to my full interviews with all of our guests on YouTube. The Switch Up was created and written by me. Script editing for this episode was done by Steph Thomas. Our booking producers are Casey Brady and Eden Tichot. Our social media manager is Tia Shepard.